What if humans didn't invent gods because they were ignorant, but because it was the smartest move they had? Before science, before medicine, before explanations, there was chaos, storms, sickness, death, and no way to understand any of it. So the human mind did what it always does under pressure. It created meaning. It created order. It created gods. Not out of stupidity, out of survival. Because when the world feels uncontrollable, the brain demands a reason. And once you understand why humans invented gods, you realize something unsettling. It didn't just make sense then. It still explains belief now. The first problem humans ever faced. Imagine the earliest humans standing at the edge of a world they could not explain. No science to test ideas, no medicine to ease pain, no language yet for causes and effects. Only raw experience and constant exposure to danger. The sky moved, the ground shook. Fire appeared and vanished. Life arrived and disappeared without warning. Every day carried the possibility of survival or sudden loss. A child grows weak for no visible reason. The breathing slows, the eyes fade. No wound, no enemy, just silence where life used to be. A hunter leaves with the sunrise and never returns. No tracks, no signs, just absence. Lightning tears the sky open in a flash, so violent it feels intentional, as if something above is watching. None of this came with instructions. None of it came with explanations. And that was the most terrifying part. Not pain, not hunger, not even death. It was not knowing why. The human brain is not built to live inside unanswered questions. Uncertainty does not feel neutral to the mind. It feels like danger, like standing in tall grass with no idea what is moving beneath it. The brain would rather accept a wrong explanation than sit with nothing at all. A bad answer at least creates the illusion of control. No answer creates paralysis. So the first problem humans faced was not morality. It was not purpose. It was not even fear itself. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty feels like death because it offers no way to prepare, no way to adapt, no way to survive. When cause and effect cannot be seen, the mind searches for patterns. When patterns cannot be found, it invents them. Not out of imagination or superstition, but out of necessity. The brain is a prediction machine. It exists to anticipate what comes next. When it cannot predict, it panics. So the mind did what it always does when faced with chaos. It filled the gap. It looked at events and asked a single question: who did this? And that is where everything begins to change. Because the solution was not logic or evidence. It was personification. Turning the unknown into something familiar. Turning chaos into intention. Turning the terrifying silence of an uncaring universe into something that could at least be spoken to. Why everything became a someone. Early humans began to notice something unsettling about the world around them. Events did not feel random. They felt intentional. When the storm came, it did not arrive like a mechanical process. It arrived with force, timing, and consequence. Trees snapped. Rain punished the land. Thunder followed like a warning. It felt angry. When rivers overflowed, they did not simply rise. They destroyed homes and took lives. It felt like punishment. When the sun returned each morning, it did not appear accidental. It felt chosen. As if something had decided that life could continue one more day. This was not poetry. It was perception. The human brain did not evolve to understand randomness. It evolved to survive. And survival depends on one thing above all else: detecting agents. Something that intends to harm you is more dangerous than something that happens by chance. So the brain learned to assume intention first and question it later. If you hear a sound in the dark, your mind does not calmly calculate probabilities. It does not ask whether wind could statistically explain it. It asks one urgent question: who is there? This bias kept our ancestors alive. Mistaking a shadow for a predator is safer than mistaking a predator for a shadow. Over thousands of generations, brains that assumed intention survived. Brains that waited for proof did not. So this way of seeing the world became automatic. Nature stopped being a collection of forces and became a collection of behaviors. The wind could be gentle or violent. Fire could protect or consume. The sky could bless or threaten. Everything gained mood. Everything gained motive. Everything gained a will. Once nature felt alive, it could no longer remain abstract. Living things need identities. They need faces, names, and temperaments. The invisible became imaginable. That is how spirits were born. Not as myths or stories, but as mental shortcuts that made the world feel readable again. But explanation was only the first step, because fear does not only want to understand what is happening, it wants to know how to stop it. And spirits, no matter how many there were, still felt unpredictable. Control was the next need. And that is where belief began to deepen into something far more powerful, the bargain that created gods. Here is the turning point where belief changes shape. Once humans began to believe that invisible forces were in control of the world, a new and urgent question emerged. Not why is this happening, but how do we influence it? Understanding alone was no longer enough. Survival demanded leverage. If something unseen controlled storms, disease, fertility, and death, then survival depended on staying in its favor. This is where spirits stopped being distant explanations and became something closer. Something relational, something you could interact with. The question was no longer what caused the storm, but what caused it to be angry. If the storm destroyed crops, perhaps it was offended. If the hunt failed, perhaps something had been neglected. If the harvest was plentiful, perhaps something had been done right. Slowly, cause and effect were rewritten as behavior and response. The world became a conversation. This is where gods were born, not as abstract forces, but as beings with preferences. A storm god who could be calmed, a harvest god who could be pleased, a fertility god who could be encouraged. Once forces had personalities, they could be reasoned with, and once they could be reasoned with, they could be bargained with. Offerings became a form of insurance. Give something now to avoid disaster later. Prayer became negotiation rather than worship. A way of saying please, a way of asking for mercy, a way of explaining yourself to the invisible. Ritual became a survival strategy. Repetition created the illusion of reliability. If the ritual worked once, it might work again. At this stage, gods were not yet moral authorities. They did not demand belief for its own sake. They were closer to powerful neighbors. Dangerous, unpredictable, but potentially cooperative. You did not love them, you managed them. You tried to stay on their good side because the cost of failure was too high. And something profound happened inside the human mind. The world began to feel less chaotic, not because it actually was, but because it now followed a narrative. Actions led to reactions. Behavior led to outcomes. Even suffering felt less random. That sense of predictability was intoxicating. It reduced anxiety. It restored a feeling of agency, and the brain rewarded it. Once the mind experiences relief from fear, it clings to whatever provided it. But this bargain came with a hidden consequence. Because once humans learned to negotiate with imagined authority, they also learned to obey it. And that psychological shift never went away. God solved a psychological crisis. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath belief. Gods did not just explain the world outside us. They explained what was happening inside us. They gave shape to emotions that were otherwise unbearable. Fear, grief, guilt, and helplessness all demanded answers, and gods provided them. Bad things happened to good people constantly. Children died, the kind suffered, the cruel often thrived. Without explanation, this reality feels intolerable. The mind rebels against it. So belief stepped in and reframed the chaos. Suffering was no longer meaningless. It was assigned a reason, a lesson, a purpose. When pain could not be prevented, it was justified. When loss could not be undone, it was reframed. You suffer for a reason. This is a test. Justice will come later. These ideas did not erase pain, but they made it survivable. They transformed raw suffering into a story with an ending that promised balance. This belief does something powerful to the human psyche. It reduces existential terror. because random suffering suggests a universe that does not care. A universe that is indifferent is far more frightening than one that is cruel but purposeful. At least cruelty implies intention. At least intention implies meaning. Meaning acts like a psychological painkiller. It does not remove the wound, but it dulls the agony. People can endure almost anything if they believe it matters. If they believe it leads somewhere. If they believe it is seen. This is why belief systems built around suffering are so resilient. They turn despair into endurance. Over time, gods became emotional anesthesia. They softened the sharp edges of reality. They allowed people to function in conditions that would otherwise break them. But anesthesia has side effects. When pain is numbed, so is resistance. Once suffering was framed as purposeful, obedience followed naturally. If pain is meaningful, then questioning it feels dangerous. If suffering is a test, then resisting it feels like failure. Endurance becomes virtue. Submission becomes strength. This shift was not forced. It felt comforting. It felt stabilizing. And that is why it worked so well, because the next step was inevitable. Once gods explained suffering, they gained authority over how humans should respond to it. And that is where belief stopped being a coping mechanism and started becoming a system of control, when gods became tools of order. As human groups grew larger, belief had to evolve with them. Small tribes could survive on shared memory and personal reputation. Large societies could not. When hundreds or thousands of people lived together, chaos was always one step away. Violence, betrayal, and selfishness threatened stability. Gods adapted to meet that challenge. They no longer lived only in forests, rivers, and skies. They moved into rules, into laws, into moral codes. Suddenly, gods were not just responsible for storms and harvests. They cared about how people behaved, who they slept with, who they obeyed, what they thought, even what they desired. This shift was not accidental. It solved a very practical problem. Invisible watchers are the most effective form of control ever created. You can avoid a king. You can lie to your neighbors. You can break rules when no one is looking. But an all-seeing God changes behavior at a deeper level. It turns surveillance inward. People begin to monitor themselves. When morality is enforced by an invisible authority, compliance does not require constant punishment. Fear becomes internal. Guilt becomes automatic. Even thoughts feel dangerous. This allowed societies to function with fewer guards, fewer enforcers, and less open violence. Order became psychological rather than physical. Gods became social glue. They bound people together through shared belief. They reduced internal conflict by creating common rules. They encouraged cooperation by promising reward and threatening consequence. In a brutal, ancient world, filled with scarcity and danger, this system worked. It created stability where none existed before. But every system that works has a cost. When gods define truth, disagreement becomes more than an opinion. It becomes rebellion. Questioning rules no longer feels like curiosity. It feels like betrayal. Doubt is no longer intellectual. It becomes moral failure. Once belief systems reached this stage, they stopped being flexible tools. They became sacred. And sacred things are not examined. They are protected. They are defended. They are passed down untouched. This is the moment when belief crossed a line. It stopped being a strategy for survival and became an authority over thought itself. And once that happens, changing your mind is no longer just difficult. It becomes dangerous. Why gods feel so real. Here is the part that believers are rarely encouraged to examine, not because it is insulting, but because it is destabilizing. Gods feel real because the human brain experiences them as real. The sensation is genuine. The emotional response is authentic. What is misunderstood is where that experience comes from. When people pray, something measurable happens inside the brain. Breathing slows, focus narrows, emotional noise quiets, the nervous system shifts from alert to regulated. This creates calm, relief, and a sense of connection. Ritual does something similar. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates safety. Safety reduces anxiety. Belief ties all of this together by offering certainty, and the mind is deeply rewarded by certainty. The brain does not like ambiguity. Uncertainty consumes energy, certainty conserves it. So when a belief offers clear answers, even comforting ones, the brain responds with relief. That relief feels profound. It feels meaningful. It feels external. But it is generated internally. So, when someone says they felt God, they are not pretending. They are not exaggerating. They are describing a real psychological state, a state of emotional regulation, meaning, and perceived connection. The experience itself is real. What is optional is the explanation attached to it. The mind is very good at assigning causes to feelings after the fact. If relief follows prayer, prayer is credited. If comfort follows belief, belief is validated. Over time, this loop strengthens. The brain learns that certain thoughts produce certain feelings. It begins to seek those thoughts again. This is how belief becomes self-reinforcing. Emotional certainty is mistaken for truth. Feeling right becomes more important than being correct. And once that happens, doubt no longer feels like curiosity. It feels like threat. Questioning no longer feels intellectual. It feels like betrayal of something that keeps you emotionally stable. This is why belief systems are so resistant to evidence. You are not just challenging an idea, you are challenging a coping mechanism. You are threatening a source of comfort. The brain responds defensively, not logically. And once emotional safety becomes tied to belief, letting go feels like loss, not of an idea, but of stability itself. That is the realization most people never reach. Gods feel real, not because they exist outside the mind, but because the mind experiences them as necessary. An understanding that changes how belief itself must be understood. What happens when the need disappears? As human understanding expanded, something subtle but profound began to shift. Storms no longer needed personalities once their patterns could be measured. Disease no longer required curses once its causes could be traced. Fear no longer demanded supernatural explanations once the mind itself became understood. With each discovery, a small piece of the unknown was removed. And as the unknown shrank, the need for divine explanation weakened. This did not happen everywhere, and it did not happen all at once. Belief systems are deeply tied to culture, identity, and emotional survival. They do not vanish the moment a better explanation appears. They fade slowly, unevenly, often painfully. But the direction of change was clear. Gods were not defeated by logic. They were replaced by understanding. When science explains lightning, the storm god becomes unnecessary. When medicine explains illness, punishment and testing lose their grip. When psychology explains fear, guilt, and comfort, divine intervention becomes less essential to emotional stability. This replacement is not aggressive, it is quiet. People do not wake up one morning and decide to abandon belief. They simply stop needing it in the same way. The belief no longer solves a problem that has already been addressed elsewhere. But something important never disappeared. The desire for meaning did not vanish with explanation. Knowing how something works does not automatically answer why life feels the way it does. Understanding mechanics does not satisfy emotional longing. Humans still seek purpose. They still seek connection. They still seek reassurance that their lives matter. This is why belief does not simply collapse when knowledge grows. Something always tries to take its place. When gods fade, other systems step in. Ideologies, identities, causes, narratives that promise meaning and certainty. So, the real question is no longer why humans invented gods. That question has an answer. The deeper and more uncomfortable question is what replaces gods when belief collapses. What fills the psychological space once occupied by divine explanation? And whether what replaces it is any less demanding, any less absolute, or any less powerful over the human mind. Because the need never disappeared. Only its form changed. The simple explanation that ties it all together. Gods were not invented because humans were foolish or naive. They were invented because humans were facing a world that was overwhelming, dangerous, and impossible to understand. Belief was not a failure of intelligence. It was a response to necessity. It filled gaps where knowledge did not yet exist and softened realities that were too painful to face directly. Gods explained the unknown when nothing else could. They soothed fear when uncertainty felt unbearable. They created order in societies that would otherwise collapse into chaos. They gave suffering a story when pain had no explanation. In every stage of human development, belief solved real problems that logic and evidence could not yet address. But gods were never external solutions. They were always reflections. They mirrored human fear of randomness and death. They reflected human hope for justice and protection. They revealed a deep longing for control in a world that refused to offer it. The more frightening life felt, the more powerful the gods became. Gods did not create humans. Humans created gods. Not consciously and not dishonestly, but psychologically. They shaped them using the only material available at the time: human emotions, human needs, human patterns of thought. Gods took on human traits because they were built to answer human problems. Once this is seen clearly, belief loses its mystery. It no longer needs to be mocked or attacked. It becomes understandable, even inevitable. Faith stops being a supernatural puzzle and becomes a psychological story about survival, meaning, and control. And that understanding changes the conversation completely. Because when belief is seen as a human invention rather than a divine truth, the question is no longer whether gods exist. The question becomes what humans needed them for, and whether those needs still require the same answers today. Here is the quiet truth most belief systems never prepare you for. Letting go of gods does not mean losing meaning. It means taking responsibility for it. No cosmic parent watching over every move. No invisible referee keeping score. Just us, facing reality as it is. That idea can feel terrifying at first, but it is also honest, because meaning chosen is stronger than meaning assigned. Truth understood is deeper than truth inherited. When fear no longer decides what you believe, clarity takes its place. Responsibility replaces obedience. Understanding replaces comfort. This is not emptiness. It is freedom, the kind that comes from standing without a script and choosing your values consciously. The real evolution of humanity was not the invention of gods. It was the moment we became capable of living without them. If this unsettled you, that is a good sign. If it made you pause, even better. And if you value truth over tradition, stay curious. Keep questioning. Subscribe not for answers, but for better questions.